And so back to the trauma and the intergenerational, now IHS had chewed me out for it, and it was around this time that I stumbled on a set of studies that was done by Israeli mental health people. And some Israeli doctors in Israel had been treating some children who had never been traumatized. These children, but they had symptoms. You know, they had depression, they had anxiety, they had all kinds of stuff. But nothing had ever happened to these kids in their life. And so what the Israeli psychologists and psychiatrists realized, and there's papers written on this, they said the trauma appears to go from one generation to the next. And they didn't know how or why, but they said that's what appears to be happening, and what happened to their ancestors in the Holocaust and in other things that happened to the Jewish people, it seems to be coming across the generations. And then they also said that it's also cumulative. And that's the scary part, because if it's several generations of trauma that don't get resolved, that means that they add up. And so then the people that inherit that trauma inherit all of those generations of trauma. So then they come in with a lot of trauma that they themselves weren't physically involved in. And they had the symptoms. And so that's why when this tribal health board told me that the symptoms weren't the problem, they were absolutely correct. Because the symptoms are just a reaction to the trauma. See, as to the soul wounding. And anybody who gets hurt in a certain way is going to react with symptoms. And the symptoms, the purpose of the symptoms are to bring attention to the spirit that needs to be healed. But a lot of times what we do in a Western way is we stay focused on the symptom, and we keep treating the symptom, and it keeps getting worse. And that's why I really hope that some of the people that work with the community here can get a little bit of an understanding that we need to go underneath. Because like I was telling the kids today, I said, if somebody sends you to drain the swamp, and you hook up your pumps and you're draining water, but there's a spring underneath feeding it, well, you're never going to drain it. And in my understanding, that is what's happening in a lot of places in Indian country, is that a lot of resources are there, there's a lot of work being done, but no one is looking at, hey, there's something feeding this at a whole other level, and that's what we need to address. And when we address the trauma, the historical trauma, then the symptoms kind of go away by themselves. And it's a real mysterious thing. And in the work that I've done, once people get an understanding of that, even, you know, things like addiction, all of a sudden, it's just not there anymore for them, because now they've healed at a whole other level. And that is what I'm hoping will stay with you in the work that we've been doing today, is that something else needs to happen at a whole other level. And as far as how this gets transmitted, I'll give you my idea, and this is also connected to the teachings of my root teacher, is that in the way of understanding trauma in the Western way is that trauma has a couple of aspects to it. And it has the physical, which is obvious, you know, you get hurt and then your body starts making medicine right away. And then there's the emotional, and your emotions get hurt, and then you can talk to somebody about that and hopefully make sense of it, and then you should be okay. But in working with the community for a long time, I've seen that just doing those two things really didn't work. I mean, it helps a little bit, but people are still suffering. And so what I thought is that there has to be something else. And so then I went back to the teachings and the fact that everything has spirit, and including the spirit of trauma. That led me to understand that there's a third component to trauma, and that's a spiritual component. And this is where it gets, I mean, it's interesting, but it's also kind of difficult, because when the person, the perpetrator that has the intent of hurting whoever they're going to hurt, you know, that is an energy that comes from spirit, and it can come from as far down as the black world or wherever it comes from, and then it connects with the heart mind. So now the person knows they want to do this, and then they take the action. And when they take the action, there's the physical and the emotional, but then there's also the spiritual intrusion. The perpetrator actually enters into the spirit of the victim with their spirit. And a lot of times it's unconscious, but some perpetrators actually are conscious of it. And so in the instance that the injury happens, the perpetrator also just shoots a part of their spirit into the victim. And when that happens, the spirit of the victim sometimes jumps out of their body because another spirit has come in to take its place. And so now the victim is out there floating somewhere. And victims will tell you that. Those of you who work with trauma, they will say, you know, I saw myself up there looking at my body. And veterans will tell you that. They say, you know, when things were looking really terrible, we were up there floating and we could see everything that was going on down there. So now they're actually out of their body, and now somebody else has come in to live in their body. And if it doesn't get the proper spiritual help, it develops a life of its own. And Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist, he calls these spirits, he uses the word complex because it's I guess it's a nicer word, I don't know. And so he says, if the complex isn't dealt with, it develops a life of its own in the unconscious. So when you translate that into native understanding, well, if the spirit doesn't get healing, it develops a life of its own in the black world. And so now in the black world you have this energy that is creating a life of its own. And now it's taking a hold of the individual that has been traumatized. And as you all know, most people that commit violence are people who have had violence done to them, right? I mean, everybody kind of knows that. And so how does that happen? Well, it's a spiritual transmission that happens from the perpetrator to the victim. Then this victim will have another victim, and you can go generation after generation passing the spirit. And if we just psychologize it, then we miss the point, and it never gets well. And so when Dr. Schindler reports that there's been, you know, suicides and people killing each other here, that's a terrible thing. But if we really want to address it, we need to figure out, where did this come from? Where did it start in the generations here? And we need to go back at least 7 generations to find the source. Because if we don't, it's going to continue staying here. And if we only do psychotherapy, and I mean, psychotherapy is a good thing. If that's all we do, we're going to be having this conversation again 20 years from now. Because guess what? That spirit doesn't care about psychotherapy. That spirit needs to be dealt with in a spiritual fashion.